They said no one could ride him. A monstrous black stallion worth millions, too wild, too violent a living storm no trainer dared face. So when the glamorous heiress of Mallory Ranch laughed before a crowd and mocked, "Ride this horse and I'll marry you," it was meant to humiliate, not to be taken seriously. But then a quiet, battle-scarred veteran stepped forward. Not for money, not for pride, and certainly not for her. What happened next would shatter her world and rewrite everything they thought they knew about fear, trust, and love. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The banners of Mallory Ranch snapped in the late afternoon wind, their scarlet fabric flashing bright against the Texas sky. Every seat in the newly built exhibition arena was filled. Rows of investors in tailored suits sat elbow to elbow with locals in worn cowboy hats, their spurs glinting as they leaned forward on the bleachers. The air was alive with expectation, humming with the anticipation of spectacle and money. For weeks, Victoria Mallory had promised that today would be a demonstration no one would forget. It was to be the coronation of her empire, a dazzling proof that Mallory Ranch stood at the cutting edge of equine technology and training. She sat in the owner's box, a figure of elegance, in a cream riding jacket and boots polished until they gleamed. A champagne flute rested in her hand, though she had barely touched it. Everything had been arranged: the lighting, the press cameras, the careful order of horses to be shown. First, the sleek Arabians, moving like silk over sand. Then the powerful chestnuts bred for show, jumping each one responding with clockwork obedience to their handlers. Each act was a brushstroke meant to paint her as an untouchable titan of the equestrian world. And yet, beneath the applause and polite murmurs, a vein of unease threaded through the crowd. Everyone knew what was coming last. Everyone was waiting for the black stallion. Midnight. The name itself carried the taste of risk, of danger. Whispers about him had circulated through the industry for months. $10 million had been poured into his breeding care and training. He was meant to be the crown jewel, the stallion who would carry Mallory Ranch into a future where bloodlines and science created perfection. But perfection had not arrived. Instead, they had created a monster. Victoria's jaw tightened as the arena gates swung open. The stallion emerged like a storm-given flesh. Midnight's coat was a river of black muscle, every sinew rippling beneath the lights. A long scar slashed down his neck, a pale reminder of some battle fought and survived. His eyes rolled white-wide with a terror so fierce it became indistinguishable from rage. The moment his hooves struck the sand, he reared high, slicing the air with hooves that could crush bone. The crowd gasped as the trainers struggled to control him. $10 million for this monster, someone muttered loudly enough that Victoria heard it. She ignored the sting, keeping her back straight, her face serene. The first trainer stepped forward, a decorated professional with medals to his name. He barely managed to grasp the reins before Midnight lunged, throwing him across the sand with terrifying ease. The man scrambled up dust, clinging to his white breeches, and limped out of the arena without a word. A second trainer tried, then a third. Each one was hurled aside, battered and humiliated. The stallion screamed, his defiant saliva foaming at his mouth, eyes rolling as though he was trapped in some unseen nightmare. The arena dissolved into chaos. Investors muttered nervously, some shaking their heads, some already calculating their losses. Locals shouted, children cried, and the name Mallory, once synonymous with power, teetered dangerously on the edge of ridicule. In the owner's box, Victoria's fingers clenched so tightly around her champagne glass that she feared it might shatter. This was supposed to be her triumph. Instead, it was a public unraveling. She could feel the judgmental eyes of her investors boring into her, waiting to see if the queen of Mallory Ranch could control the disaster unfolding below. She rose to her feet. The microphone picked up her voice strong and sharp, amplified until it rang through the cavernous space. "If anyone can ride this horse," she said, her lips curling in a smile that was all venom, "I'll marry him." The arena froze in silence. For a beat, not a single breath stirred. And then the laughter came. Nervous at first, then bolder, rolling through the stands like a wave. The investors chuckled into their drinks. The locals slapped their knees. Even some of her staff allowed themselves tight smirks. Everyone understood the joke. It was an execution disguised as a challenge. A barb of sarcasm, a way to twist humiliation into theater. No man alive could ride that horse. "She's making a joke out of it," one of the investors said knowingly. Heads nodded. Of course she was. The tension of fear dissolved into ridicule. The atmosphere shifted from anxious to mocking. And for a moment, Victoria felt the scales tip back into her favor. Yes, better to laugh at her cruelty than at her failure. But the laughter died as quickly as it had begun. A figure moved from the shadows near the far gate. Daniel Hayes. Few noticed him before now. He was a man who blended into the background content to push a broom to carry hay to scrub stalls in silence. His clothes were simple faded denim and a plain shirt stained with the labor of the ranch. He was just another hand in a world that barely glanced at men like him. Yet, as he stepped onto the sand, something in the way he carried himself caught the eye. Not arrogance, not bravado, simply a quiet steadiness, as if the chaos around him did not touch him. His gaze lifted to the stallion, and he did not flinch. Midnight reared, crashing back to the ground with a scream that sent dust spiraling into the air. The crowd leaned forward, expecting the man to retreat to run. Instead, Daniel walked closer, slow, deliberate. "I'll do it," he said. The words were not shouted. They did not need amplification. Somehow they carried clear and calm across the vast space. The laughter stuttered into silence. Then, disbelieving, it rose again, louder, crueler. "He'll get himself killed," a woman near the rail scoffed. "Crazy fool," another muttered. But Daniel's eyes never left the stallion. He saw what the others didn't, the trembling in Midnight's flanks, the frantic flick of his ears, the desperation buried beneath the rage. He knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of men cornered in war zones, screaming in the only language they had left. "Not for money," Daniel added quietly. "Not for marriage." His voice held no tremor. He lifted a hand and pointed not at Victoria, not at the investors, but at the stallion. For him. The mockery in the stands faltered. Murmurs replaced laughter. Pity, disbelief, a strange unease rippled through the crowd. Victoria's face flushed. She had expected groveling, a desperate attempt at humor to deflect her sarcasm. Not this. Not a man who accepted her grenade of humiliation and tossed it back at her feet. For a heartbeat, she considered retracting her words, but the eyes of the investors pinned her down, demanding she keep her pride intact. She could not appear weak, not here, not now. She straightened her smile, sharpening into ice. "Fine," she said, her voice echoing through the microphone. "You want him? You have 1 month. At the fall rodeo, you'll ride him before this crowd. If you can, the deal stands." The murmurs swelled disbelief, mingling with morbid fascination. Daniel gave a single nod. Nothing more. No bravado, no speech. Just a man accepting an impossible task. He turned and walked toward the gate. His stride calm, unhurried. He didn't look back at the stallion, though Midnight's wild eyes followed him until he disappeared through the tunnel. The crowd erupted in murmurs again, confusion and intrigue buzzing like hornets. Victoria remained standing in her box, her pulse racing beneath her calm exterior. Her smirk had returned, but it felt brittle fragile. In the space of minutes, her perfectly orchestrated world had been shaken. The janitors she barely noticed had stolen the spotlight, not by force or charm, but by quiet defiance. Down below midnight, still pawed the sand, nostrils flaring. 3 figures remained at the center of the storm: Victoria Mallory, standing tall but inwardly unsettled; Daniel Hayes, already fading into the shadows, but leaving behind an echo of resolve; and Midnight, the raging stallion, destined to become the axis upon which all their fates would turn. The bet meant as a joke had become something far more dangerous. The chaos of the exhibition had not yet settled when Victoria Mallory strode through the glass doors of the ranch headquarters. Her boots struck the polished floor with sharp authority, the sound echoing off marble and steel. Behind her trailed half a dozen managers, 2 assistants juggling tablets, and the ranch's lead attorney, a gaunt man with silver hair and a briefcase that seemed always glued to his hand. Victoria's jaw was set like stone. She had smiled for the investors as she exited the arena, even raised her glass as if nothing had gone wrong. But inside, the humiliation festered like acid. A janitor, a man paid to muck stalls and sweep dust, had stolen the spotlight from her. He had not begged forgiveness. He had not shrunk away. He had met her sarcasm with quiet defiance, and in front of everyone forced her into a wager she had not meant to give. Now she would make sure he regretted it. "Conference room," she snapped. "Now." They obeyed. Within minutes, the long oak table was lined with executives and lawyers, pens poised, eyes wary. Victoria stood at the head, her riding jacket still buttoned tight, her blonde hair pulled into its severe chignon, not a strand out of place despite the storm brewing inside her. "Draft a contract," she ordered. "If the janitor wants to play cowboy, we'll make sure the whole world sees him fail in writing." The lawyer hesitated. "Miss Mallory, a verbal statement in front of witnesses? Not enough," she cut in. "I want it ironclad. A performance clause. In 1 month at the fall rodeo, he will mount Midnight before the public. If he succeeds, fine. If he fails," her lip curled, "he leaves Mallory Ranch for good." One of the managers coughed. "Should we add a penalty, of course? A symbolic fee. Make it sting, but not enough to bankrupt him. I want this legal, not cruel." The point her eyes narrowed is humiliation, not sympathy. Pens scratched across paper. Clauses appeared like shackles: 1 month, 1 horse, 1 impossible ride. Failure meant dismissal. Failure meant ridicule sealed in ink. Victoria leaned over the draft, her perfume crisp and cold. "There," she said at last. "Turn his bravado into a noose. He asked for this. Let him choke on it." Word of the contract spread like wildfire. By the next morning, the janitor's wager was the only topic on the ranch. In the break room, hands slapped tables in disbelief. In the stables, grooms whispered and shook their heads. Some laughed openly, others smirked with pity. But the real spectacle came when Daniel Hayes was summoned. The conference room was filled to bursting when he walked in. Every department head was present, along with a handful of investors who lingered after the exhibition, eager for one last taste of drama before returning to their city towers. The contract lay on the table, bound in leather pages, thick with legalese. Daniel paused at the door. His boots were dusty, his shirt threadbare, the calluses on his hands visible even from across the room. Compared to the tailored suits and polished shoes around the table, he looked like a ghost from another world. Victoria sat at the head, her smile razor sharp. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone dripping with false courtesy. "We've put your request in writing. Please read carefully before you embarrass yourself further." A ripple of laughter circled the room. Daniel didn't react. He pulled out the chair, sat down, and opened the contract. His eyes moved steadily down the page. He didn't linger, didn't stumble. When he reached the final line, he set the pen against the paper and signed his name in a clear, unhurried hand. Silence fell. The room expected hesitation, questions, excuses. Instead, in less than a minute, the janitor had bound himself to an impossible wager. He set the pen down. Then, almost as an afterthought, he picked it back up. Flipping to the final page, he drew a single line beneath the last clause and wrote in block letters, "All training sessions with Midnight must be conducted in private. No interference." He slid the document back across the table. The silence deepened, heavy and suffocating. Eyes widened. The lawyer's jaw slackened. Victoria's nails tapped the wood in irritation. He hadn't just signed. He had placed his own condition carving space for himself within her carefully constructed trap. The first to break the silence was Colton Briggs. The former head trainer of Midnight leaned back in his chair, his broad chest filling with laughter. It was not kind laughter, but sharp and ugly, meant to cut. "You think you can handle that devil alone?" His voice carried across the table. "That horse will tear you apart before you last 5 seconds." A few of the staff chuckled nervously, emboldened by his confidence. Colton had scars to prove his history, with midnight long welts across his ribs where hooves had struck. He had been thrown, bitten, nearly trampled. If anyone knew the beast's fury, it was him. "You're a dreamer," Hayes Colton sneered. "A janitor playing cowboy. This ranch has spent millions trying to tame that monster, and you think a month of broom swinging is going to change him? You'll be lucky if they can scrape what's left of you off the sand." Snickers rippled through the room. Several employees exchanged bets under their breath. 5 seconds, 10 at most. Some were already planning the spectacle of his defeat. But Daniel didn't answer. He sat still, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. His silence was not weakness, it was unnerving. His eyes, calm and steady, met Colton's for a moment. The trainer shifted uncomfortably, as though he'd expected fire and found only stone. The silence dragged on, until it became unbearable, until even those who mocked him found themselves fidgeting. Victoria finally cleared her throat. "Well," she said, gathering the room back under her control. "It's settled. The contract is binding. In 1 month's time, Mr. Hayes will provide us all with entertainment." Her smile returned, brittle but victorious. Meeting adjourned. Outside the glass walls, the whispers began at once. "He's just a broke drifter," one investor muttered, pulling on his coat. "This will be his funeral." Another scoffed. "A stable hand with nothing to lose. He's chasing a few minutes of attention before he disappears again." The managers echoed the sentiment in quieter tones. The ranch hands spread it through the stalls like gossip carried on the wind. By evening, the entire property buzzed with wagers. How many seconds before the horse threw him? 5, 10. Would he stand up afterward, or would they carry him out on a stretcher? Victoria watched the rumors swirl with satisfaction. This was exactly what she wanted. Before the first day of training even began, Daniel Hayes had been reduced to a joke. A scapegoat. A man walking willingly into humiliation. And she told herself, as she returned to her penthouse suite above the ranch, that the matter was under control. Yet somewhere deep beneath the layers of pride and calculation, a flicker of unease whispered. The janitor had not begged. The janitor had not flinched. The janitor had signed. And then calmly, deliberately, he had written a line that changed the rules. The first official training session was announced on the ranch bulletin board before dawn. By mid-morning, half the staff had found excuses to linger near the arena, and a handful of investors stayed over from the previous night just to watch the spectacle. Whispers carried down the barn aisles. Today's the day the janitor gets himself killed. The arena had been cleared. Midnight stood inside the round pen ears, flat against his skull tail, lashing in fury. He pawed trenches into the sand nostrils, flaring with each angry breath. His black coat gleamed with sweat, though no work had yet been done. The steel gate clanged as handlers shoved him in, retreating fast before he could strike. The crowd pressed against the rails. Some leaned forward eagerly, hoping for blood, while others crossed their arms with a smug certainty that they were about to witness a fool's quick downfall. The atmosphere had the flavor of an execution. Then Daniel Hayes entered. He wore the same clothes he always did. Faded denim boots scarred with age, a shirt rolled up at the sleeves. No gloves, no whip, no rope. His hands hung loose at his sides. He carried nothing but himself. The steel door slammed shut behind him, and the echo of the locking pin rang across the sand like the toll of a bell. Midnight let out a shrill scream, the sound raw enough to rattle the chest of every spectator. He lunged, muscles exploding, hooves pounding toward the intruder. A woman in the stands cried out, covering her mouth. Others braced instinctively, ready to see the man crushed. But Daniel did not move. He stood rooted, his shoulders low, arms, relaxed eyes steady on the horse. He didn't flinch, didn't reach for defense, didn't even raise a hand. His stillness was absolute. At the last instant, Midnight veered aside, missing him by inches. Dust sprayed across Daniel's boots. The stallion spun, wheeled, reared again, screaming in frustration. But the man remained as unmoving as a tree rooted deep in the earth. Minutes stretched into eternity. The horse circled, snapping his teeth, feinting charges. Daniel breathed. That was all. Confusion rippled through the onlookers. "Is he doing nothing?" one of the investors muttered. "What kind of trick is this?" But no trick came. Just silence. Just patience. The next day, the crowd returned, eager to see whether the janitor would finally act like a trainer or whether Midnight would finish what he'd started. Once again, Daniel stepped into the pen, empty-handed. He walked to the fence, leaned his shoulder lightly against the rail, and crossed his arms loosely. His body spoke one message: I am no threat. Midnight bellowed ears, pinned foam flecking his mouth. He reared high, crashing down with enough force to shake the sand. He charged, halted, wheeled, circled again. Daniel's expression never changed. His breath was slow, his eyes calm. He neither challenged nor retreated. Some of the younger stable hands began to whisper among themselves, the thrill of violence fading into impatience. "How long do you think he lasts this time?" one whispered. 5 minutes before he snaps, another said. 10 if the horse gets bored first. But an hour passed. An hour of screaming hooves and slashing teeth, and Daniel still as the horizon. Midnight, in contrast, was lathered in sweat, sides heaving. When the bell finally rang to signal the session's end, it was the stallion, not the man, who looked exhausted. The crowd left muttering, "What a waste of time." By the end of the week, Daniel's strange routine had become the ranch's favorite joke. Around the barns, grooms smirked and mimicked him, standing stiff with arms loose at their sides, eyes wide and unblinking, mocking the statue cowboy. They called him the staring man or the broom rider. Laughter rolled each time the stories spread. At the local saloon, Colton Briggs made certain the laughter stayed loud. With a whiskey glass in hand, he declared to anyone who would listen, he's not training that horse. He's letting it rot in the pen Mallory's paying him to meditate while the beast gets fatter. His audience roared with approval. They raised toasts to the poor fool doomed to humiliation. Some of the hands at the ranch joined in the parody. They planted themselves like statues in the yard arms, dangling until the laughter drew eyes their way. But through it all, Daniel said nothing. He came each day, opened the gate, stepped inside, and became stillness itself. Every insult slid off him like rain off stone. Every jeer dissolved into the dust at his boots. It was as though he had decided that silence was his weapon, his shield, and his gift. Victoria Mallory should have been satisfied. She had what she wanted, a spectacle that humiliated the man who had dared challenge her, and by extension, the horse that had humiliated her before the investors. On paper, it was perfection. And yet, she could not look away. The contract Daniel had signed stipulated privacy. But she had installed cameras in the rafters anyway, high-definition lenses hidden among the beams of the training pen. Every session was streamed directly into her office, 4 screens glowing in the shadows of leather chairs and white marble. At first, she poured herself a wine and watched with fury. He's wasting my time. My horse. My money, she muttered. She jabbed the pause button, scoffed at his stillness, and told herself she'd fire him within the week. But then she found herself returning glass in hand, watching longer. Day after day, she saw the same impossible calm. Midnight would hurl himself against the fence 10 times 20. Each time, Daniel neither blinked nor stiffened. His breathing stayed steady, shoulders loose, gaze soft, but unyielding. It was not passivity. It was presence. And slowly, against her will, Victoria's fury blurred into something more dangerous fascination. Why didn't he move? Why didn't he run? How could a man stand in front of that violence and remain untouched? She leaned closer to the screen, studying every angle. She noticed the smallest details, the way Daniel's hands never clenched, the way his chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm, the way his eyes softened whenever Midnight's head turned his way. It was infuriating. It was inexplicable. And she couldn't stop watching. By the 4th evening, she realized she had not checked her email once. The contracts on her desk lay unsigned. Mallory Ranch, her empire, could crumble outside her office walls, and she would not notice because her entire being was bound to the silent theater playing out on the screens. A bitter thought crept in. He's breaking me, not the horse. The silence spread beyond the office, beyond the barns. It became the ranch's newest currency of gossip. He's either a genius or a lunatic, whispered the housekeeper to the cook. So this is the Mallory experiment, an investor sneered. Paying a drifter to stare at a horse. And yet, not everyone scoffed. A few old ranch hands, men who had worked with horses since boyhood, began to notice details too subtle for the mockers. Midnight still screamed and charged, but his charges no longer crashed against the rail at full force. Sometimes he stopped a few feet short. Sometimes his ears flicked forward just for a second toward the motionless man at the center of his storm. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't surrender. But it was different. Did you see that, one old groom murmured. He hesitated. Another scratched his beard. Never seen him hesitate before. Their voices were low, careful. To admit interest in the janitor's method was to invite ridicule, so they watched in secret, in silence, waiting. And Daniel, oblivious or unconcerned with their whispers, kept coming. He never explained. He never defended. He never spoke of strategy. He simply entered the pen, stood, and waited. as though time itself was his only tool. The ranch was alive with noise, laughter, ridicule, gossip, doubt. But inside the training pen, each day began and ended with silence. A silence that deepened, thickened, until it pressed against the chests of those who watched. To the impatient, it looked like failure. To the curious, it looked like a puzzle. To Daniel, it was the only language that mattered. By the 10th day, the novelty had worn off. At first, the spectacle of Daniel Hayes standing motionless in the pen with the black stallion had been a source of endless jokes and sneers. Crowds of stable hands managers and curious locals had come to see him train midnight, eager for either a miracle or a bloodbath. When neither arrived, amusement curdled into boredom. Now the ranch hummed with cynicism. "Bet you $1 he quits this week," one stable hand muttered as he shoveled straw into a wheelbarrow. "I'll take that bet," another replied, smirking. "He'll last till payday, then walk off when the old man in him finally snaps." In the corner of the mess hall, Colton Briggs held court like a preacher of doom. His whiskey glass clinked against the table as he repeated the same line over and over, with the relish of a man who believed his own certainty was proof. "That horse will never change. He's laughing at you all. Every day you stand there waiting for a show, and every day that devil beast just toys with the janitor. This whole thing is a farce." Heads nodded. No one challenged him. Within 2 weeks, the general mood was clear. Daniel was a statue. Midnight was a monster. And the so-called method was a waste of air. The heat of the Texas sun weighed heavy on the ranch. The pens buzzed with flies, and the smell of hay and horse sweat thickened the air. But in the arena itself, time seemed suspended, circling endlessly in dust and silence. And yet something was shifting. It happened one quiet afternoon with most of the staff gone about their chores. The sky was white-hot, the sand in the pen shimmering under the relentless sun. Midnight had been pacing for the better part of an hour, tail lashing chest dark with sweat. Then, unexpectedly, he stopped. Instead of bellowing his fury or crashing against the rail, the stallion stood still, sides heaving, his dark eyes fixed on Daniel. He stamped once, twice, sending up small puffs of dust, then lowered his head just slightly, not in surrender, but in watchfulness. The silence was startling. Daniel felt it immediately. His breath caught, though he kept his body loose, his posture unchanged. He knew this was different. Midnight wasn't exploding, wasn't raging. The stallion's focus had narrowed, and for the first time, Daniel was not being treated as an intruder to be destroyed. The only sound was the heavy rush of the horse's breathing echoing in the pen, like the slow bellows of a forge. Dust drifted lazily in the shafts of light, carrying the stillness with it. Daniel lowered his eyes, deliberately softening the energy he gave off, while his mind whispered the words he didn't dare speak aloud. "Something's changing. Keep still. Let him decide." An hour passed like this, one man standing calm, one stallion watching. The heat pressed down the world outside, forgotten. And then Daniel chose his moment. Slowly, carefully, he shifted. He moved not forward, not closer, but downward. With deliberate calm, he bent his knees and sank onto the sand, folding his legs beneath him. He rested his back lightly against the rail arms draped over his knees. To the casual eye, it looked like exhaustion. To Midnight, it was something else. A shrinking of presence, a lessening of threat. The stallion's ears flicked forward, uncertain. He snorted, tossing his head, testing the air. From the viewing platform, a handful of stable hands who had lingered to watch erupted into whispers. "Is he giving up?" one hissed. "He's finally snapped," another said with a laugh. "Guess he's decided to nap his way through humiliation." But inside the pen, Daniel's intention was clear. Horses understood size, understood posture. A man standing tall was a predator. A man sitting cross-legged in the dust was something else. Midnight circled once, hooves biting into the sand. He blew out a sharp breath, ears swiveling. Then slowly, he took a step, and another. The distance was still wide yards of space between them. But for the first time since the wager began, the horse had moved not in attack, but in curiosity. Unseen by most, a witness stood frozen at the edge of the barn doors. Tommy Rivera, one of the youngest stable hands on the ranch, had wandered by with a bucket of feed and stopped dead when he saw the stallion hesitate. His jaw slackened, eyes wide. He had never seen Midnight do anything but rage and strike. Now the horse was listening. The boy's heart thudded. He pressed closer to the rail, knuckles white against the wood, afraid to even breathe lest he break the spell. His whisper cracked the silence. "He's listening to you." The words were soft, almost lost to the wind, but Daniel heard them. His eyes flicked briefly toward the boy, then back to the horse. He didn't speak. Speech now would only shatter the fragile thread forming, but inwardly he acknowledged the truth. This was not surrender. This was not victory. But it was the first signal, the first sliver of recognition that Daniel's presence was not only endured, but considered. Tommy didn't know it yet. But from that day on, he would carry the memory like a secret ember. While the rest of the ranch mocked, he would remember what he saw: a monster pausing to listen. In her penthouse office, high above the barns, Victoria Mallory sat before her wall of screens, a glass of red wine trembling faintly in her hand. She had grown accustomed to the monotony of watching the janitor stand still. It was a private indulgence she justified as vigilance. She told herself she watched only to record failure, only to know when to end the charade. But now the feed showed something else. Her lips parted as she leaned forward, eyes fixed. Midnight was not screaming. Midnight was not charging. Midnight was standing a-watching, and God help her, taking steps toward the man in the dirt. The wine in her glass shivered as her fingers tightened around the stem. Her heart beat faster, louder than she wanted to admit. Coincidence, she hissed under her breath. Just coincidence. Behind her, her young assistant Finn entered quietly, tablet clutched like a shield. "Progress, ma'am?" he asked, cautious. Victoria didn't look away from the screen. Her voice was cold-clipped. "He's still wasting my time." Finn nodded quickly, retreating without further question. Only when the door clicked shut did she set her glass down and rewind the footage. Once, twice, again. Watching every flick of the horse's ears, every shift of Daniel's posture. Her certainty eroded grain by grain, replaced by something she despised even more than doubt. Curiosity. She ran the clip again, frame by frame, eyes narrowing. Midnight's hooves shifted, his ears twitched forward. Daniel lowered himself into the sand, unthreatening, grounded. The horse stepped closer. It wasn't chance. It was something else. For the first time since she had bought Midnight Victoria, Mallory did not feel entirely in control. By nightfall, the gossip wheel of the ranch turned as usual. But under the surface, something had changed. Most still scoffed. Most still bet against Daniel. But whispers had begun, thin threads of doubt that tangled into the minds of those who had seen too much. And in the heart of the pen, where silence spoke louder than any whip, the first crack had opened in the wall between man and beast. The saloon in Redstone was never quiet, not even on a Tuesday night. The air was thick with the tang of spilled beer, and fried food guitars twanged somewhere near the back, and ranch hands hunched over poker tables with cigarettes dangling from their lips. Victoria Mallory sat in a high-backed booth near the window, a glass of bourbon resting in her manicured hand. She hated places like this. Sawdust floors, smoke-stained ceilings, the scent of cheap liquor. Yet here she was nursing a drink like one of the locals, because she hadn't been able to shake the images replaying in her mind since that afternoon. Midnight watching, midnight listening, midnight stepping closer. She wasn't here for comfort. She was here for information. Sheriff Hank Douglas slid into the booth across from her. His Stetson landed on the seat beside him, and his weathered hands curled around his beer with the ease of a man who had lived his whole life in rooms like this. Hank had been sheriff in these parts longer than Victoria had run Mallory Ranch, and he carried himself with a kind of calm authority that came from decades of keeping peace where men preferred violence. "What do you really know about that drifter you put in the pen with Midnight?" Hank asked without preamble. Victoria arched a brow, enough to know he signed a contract. The sheriff gave a humorless chuckle. "That's not knowing. That's paperwork." He took a long sip of beer before setting the glass down with a heavy clink. "You're playing with a man you don't understand, Victoria." Her expression didn't change, though her fingers tightened around the bourbon. "He's a janitor, Hank. A man with more stubbornness than sense." "Janitor, sure. That's what you see." The sheriff leaned in slightly, his voice dropping low, cutting beneath the saloon's noise. "But I knew his name long before you put him in that pen." Something in her chest shifted, though she kept her eyes cool. "Go on." Hank's gaze was steady, a mixture of pity and respect. Daniel Hayes served with the cavalry in Iraq. Not some weekend soldier. He was the real thing. Combat tours, mounted patrols through villages where every shadow could hide an ambush. He took a hit during one of those ambushes. Shrapnel tore through his leg. Damn near didn't make it out alive. Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. "He carries more than scars on his skin," Hank continued. "That man carries ghosts. PTSD, they call it now. Nightmares that don't end when you wake up. He came home, but he never really came home. Drifted. Couldn't keep a steady job, not because he was lazy, but because the noise in his head wouldn't quit. So he moves. Keeps moving. Sweeping floors here, hauling feed there. Quiet work. Work where nobody asks questions." The bourbon glass no longer felt steady in her grip. "He's not just some janitor," Hank said finally, his voice grave. "He's a man carrying ghosts you and I can't imagine." For once, Victoria Mallory had no retort. She stared into the amber swirl of her drink, realizing her hand was trembling. The sheriff's words followed her long after she left the saloon. Daniel had lost more than she had ever considered. Comrades he called brothers, a sense of belonging, the ability to close his eyes without seeing fire and sand. He had survived the desert, survived the silence afterward, only to find himself cleaning stalls at her ranch. Most men would have broken. Most men would have drowned themselves in whiskey or rage. Yet Daniel Hayes stood still in the pen with a $10 million stallion screaming in his face, and he did not flinch. Victoria sat in her office that night, the lights dim, city-like towers of paperwork forgotten on her desk. Her screens glowed with paused footage from earlier in the day. Daniel lowering himself to the sand midnight, watching ears flicked forward. She had once dismissed his stillness as stupidity. Now she saw it with new eyes. This wasn't nothing. This wasn't comedy. This was a soldier's discipline. A man who had stared down death in a war zone was not going to tremble before a horse, no matter how wild. Her thoughts tangled. For the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong about Daniel, about midnight, about herself. She despised the feeling, but she could not deny it. The next breakthrough came 3 days later under a sky stretched pale with evening. The round pen was nearly empty of onlookers now. The jeers had thinned as boredom reclaimed the crowd. Only a couple of stable hands lingered, leaning half-heartedly against the rails. They expected the same show of nothingness. Daniel entered as always, his boots quiet in the sand. Midnight's snorted muscles quivering, but he did not scream. He stood head-tossing, eyes wild, but not quite as wild as before. Minutes passed. The heat shimmered. Dust swirled lazily. Then for the first time, Midnight's fury faltered. He stopped circling. He stopped lunging. He simply stood watching. Daniel let the silence deepen. He felt the horses breathing across the sand, felt the raw energy that still trembled in the stallion's body. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted one hand and extended it forward. Palm open, fingers loose, an invitation without demand. The horse's ears flicked. He snorted, stomped once, twice. Then with agonizing slowness, he took a step, and another. Dust puffed beneath each hoof. The world seemed to narrow until it contained only two beings, man and horse soldier and survivor, each haunted by different battles. At last, Midnight's muzzle stretched forward. Warm breath touched Daniel's skin. Then with a tentative, almost trembling motion, the stallion pressed his nose into the center of the man's palm. A murmur rose from the stable hands. Daniel did not move too quickly. He let the moment breathe, then gently slid his hand upward, fingers brushing the curve of Midnight's neck. The horse trembled, every muscle taut, as though expecting pain. But no pain came, only touch. "Easy boy," Daniel whispered, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of a promise. "No one's gonna hurt you again." The stallion shuddered, then stilled. For the first time in years, Midnight allowed a human hand to rest against his skin. Victoria had not meant to be there. She had been walking the stables, irritation gnawing at her nerves, trying to banish the restless energy Hank Douglas's words had stirred. She turned the corner and froze. Through the slats of the arena rail, she saw him. Daniel Hayes, the janitor she had mocked in front of investors, the drifter she had signed into humiliation, and the man she thought would break, was standing with his hand pressed against Midnight's neck. And Midnight was letting him. Her throat constricted, her pulse thundered. She gripped the wooden post to steady herself. All the trainers she had hired, all the experts she had paid fortunes, none of them had achieved this. None of them had been able to reach through the stallion's terror and touch him without being struck down. But Daniel had. A janitor, a drifter, a soldier carrying ghosts. For the first time in her life, Victoria Mallory felt her pride crack, not from failure, not from ridicule, but from the sight of a man doing something she had believed impossible. And in that moment, she saw him differently. Not as a nuisance, not as a joke, but as a man who had faced monsters within and without, and met them with silence, patience, and unshakable will. Respect bloomed where contempt once lived, and though she clenched her jaw and straightened her shoulders as if nothing had changed, she knew the truth. The ground beneath her convictions had shifted. The ranch was never the same after that day. For Midnight, the world no longer consisted only of chains and fear. For Daniel, the pen was no longer a cage of jeers, but the beginning of fragile trust. And for Victoria Mallory, the woman who had thought herself untouchable, it was the first step towards seeing a man not as a pawn in her wager, but as something far more dangerous. A man worth respecting. Colton Briggs had always been a man who thrived in the shadows of resentment. Once he had been Mallory Ranch's crown jewel, the star trainer, the one investors nodded to when they spoke of cutting-edge equine science. But now his name was fading, swallowed by the whisper of something absurd. A janitor standing silent in a pen, commanding the attention that had once been his. Each day, he saw Daniel's stillness becoming less of a joke and more of a question mark. Each day, he felt himself shrinking further into irrelevance. And then came the meeting. It happened in the quiet shade of the ranch's parking lot, far from the eyes of grooms and guests. Leland Blackwood leaned against his black sedan, his silver hair catching the late afternoon light. His tailored suit looked out of place among the dust and grit, but the disdain in his eyes fit perfectly. "You and I have the same problem," Leland said smoothly. He produced a fat envelope and tapped it against his palm. "That problem's name is Daniel Hayes, and if this farce continues, we both stand to lose." Colton's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Leland pressed the envelope into his hands. "Remind that beast what it is. Fear, rage, chaos. Break the illusion. Make the janitor fail." The trainer's lips twisted into something between a smirk and a snarl. "Consider it done." And with that, a pact was sealed not with words, but with money and malice. The moon was thin and sharp as a knife when Colton moved. Midnight lay restless in his stall, the rhythm of his breathing steadying after weeks of tentative peace. Colton slipped through the darkened stable with practiced ease. He carried a length of rawhide whip coiled at his side and a short iron rod concealed in his jacket. His boots made no sound on the straw-strewn floor. The stall door creaked open. Midnight's ears flicked up instantly, eyes wide with the reflex of prey. Colton stepped inside, his smile a cold flash in the dark. "Remember me, devil." The whip cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Midnight screamed the sound tearing through the rafters. He reared hooves slamming against the wooden wall. The iron bar struck across his flank with a dull, sickening thud. The stallion went wild. Foam flecked his mouth, his massive body twisting, slamming against the boards, as if he might break through. The air filled with the stink of sweat and fear, with the metallic tang of blood, as the whip kissed skin again and again. Colton's eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction. "Let's see how far your precious janitor gets when you remember what you really are." When at last he slipped out, leaving the stall reeking of panic, Midnight trembled in the corner, his eyes showing white, his chest heaving like a dying bellows. The scars of fear had been carved deeper than any whip could reach. Daniel arrived before sunrise, carrying nothing but the calm presence that had become his ritual. But as soon as he turned down the stable aisle, his steps faltered. Something was wrong. The smell hit him first, sharp, raw, coppery. Blood. Fear. He reached the stall and froze. Midnight was unrecognizable. His black coat was streaked with sweat and foam, his flanks striped with fresh welts. His sides heaved, nostrils flaring, every muscle quivering. He pressed himself so tightly into the corner that the wood groaned beneath his weight, as if he could vanish into the wall itself. Daniel's chest constricted. "Jesus," he whispered. He stepped closer, voice soft. But Midnight's response was instant and violent. The stallion screamed, eyes rolling white, and threw himself harder against the wall. Daniel staggered back, the rejection like a knife in his gut. He sank onto the rail, burying his face in his hands. Weeks of patient silence and fragile trust shattered in a single night. His throat ached as he whispered, "What did they do to you, boy?" The horse trembled, his breath ragged, refusing even the sound of comfort. And Daniel, for the first time, felt the crushing weight of despair. Colton Briggs arrived as though summoned by the scent of failure. He walked casually down the aisle, arms folded, his smirk wide as a wound. told you," he said, his voice loud enough for every stable hand within earshot. "You can't change a beast's nature. He's just showing you what he really is." A few younger grooms glanced nervously at one another, some nodding faintly, too intimidated by Colton's confidence to question him. Daniel didn't look up. He sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the quivering stallion in the corner. Colton tilted his head, savoring the sight. "What's the matter, soldier boy devil? Get the best of you. Thought you could stare him into being tame, now you see. He's nothing but a monster. And you..." He let the word hang, dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but a fool." But Daniel did not rise to the bait. His silence, heavy and steady, was more infuriating than any retort. Colton sneered and walked away, the echo of his boots sharp with triumph. Victoria Mallory heard the news within the hour. She strode into the stables in tailored slacks and boots still gleaming from polish, her face a mask of cold fury. But when she saw Midnight, the mask cracked. Her stallion, her prize, her investment, her obsession was shaking like a beaten stray. Red welts marred his flanks. His eyes darted wild, not just in fear, but in betrayal. Her gaze shifted to Daniel. He was seated on a hay bale outside the stall, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The scene spoke for itself. She crouched near the rail, tracing a finger across the angry mark on Midnight's hide. It was unmistakable. The width, the depth. A whip. Her jaw tightened. Daniel didn't use whips. She knew that much. "Lock this place down," she barked, her voice slicing through the silence. "No one in, no one out until I say otherwise." "Yes, ma'am," the stable manager stammered, scrambling. "Get me the security feeds from every angle of this barn. I want them on my desk in 10 minutes. The footage at first appeared spotless. Hours of empty aisles, the stall undisturbed, too clean, too perfect. Her IT specialist squinted at the data logs. This isn't raw feed, ma'am. There's a loop patched in here." 4 minutes played over and over. Someone covered their tracks. "Find the seams," she snapped. It took hours, but eventually a fragment surfaced, a grainy shot from a camera overlooking the parking lot. Colton Briggs, Leland Blackwood. A fat envelope changing hands. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her hands curling into fists. Fury burned through her veins, sharp and electric. They had dared to sabotage her horse, to break her experiment, to undermine her. It was time to make an example. The call went out that evening, mandatory assembly. Every ranch hand, every trainer, every executive, even a few investors who hadn't yet left the grounds, gathered in the main hall. The air was thick with curiosity and unease. Victoria Mallory stood at the front, a screen behind her. She pressed a button. The grainy video played Colton accepting the envelope from Leland. The room buzzed with gasps and whispers. Then she reached into her coat and flung the very same envelope onto the table before Colton. Bills spilled across the wood like spilled blood. The trainer's face drained of color. "You," he stammered. "You sabotaged my horse." Victoria said coldly, her voice carrying like steel. "You conspired to destroy the work of this ranch for your own pride. And you, Mr. Blackwood." She turned her glare to the investor in his fine suit. "You thought you could gamble with my legacy. Your bank records are very clear." Leland opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came. The evidence was too damning, the murmurs too loud. Victoria's eyes swept the room sharp as a blade. Then she spoke the words that would echo long after the meeting ended. "From now on, Daniel speaks for this horse. His word is final." A stunned silence followed. Then a ripple of murmurs spread like wildfire. Stable hands exchanged wide-eyed looks. Investors shifted in their seats. For the first time, Victoria Mallory had taken her stand, not with her board, not with her money, but with the man she had once mocked. And in that moment, everything changed. The stable smelled of fear. Even after 3 days, Daniel could still feel it clinging to the walls, hanging in the straw like smoke after a fire. Midnight no longer raged when he approached, but neither did he trust. The stallion pressed himself into the farthest corner, as though trying to erase his own existence. And whenever Daniel made a move closer than a few feet, the animal's body tensed with panic. It was as if all the progress they had fought for had been swept away in one brutal night. Daniel didn't curse. He didn't shout. He simply accepted the reality with the same weary patience he had carried since the war. You can't will broken things to heal. You can only be there steady and constant until they decide to try again. So he started over. Every morning and every evening, Daniel sat outside the stall on an upturned bucket or a bale of hay. He didn't push. He didn't coax. He just talked his low voice, carrying into the straw-scented air. Sometimes he told Midnight about the weather, how the storms rolling off the plains smelled like copper before they broke. Other times he spoke of small things, a story about a scrappy dog he had as a boy, a memory of his mother humming while she cooked fragments of life that seemed too small to matter, but gave his voice texture and rhythm. Midnight didn't respond. Not at first. The stallion's ears twitched, but his eyes remained wide, his body trembling. It didn't matter. Daniel kept talking. He spoke as if to an old friend who'd forgotten how to answer. Stable hands passed by, shaking their heads. "He's wasting time," they muttered. "The horse is gone. Broken for good." But Daniel knew better. He had seen men in that same posture in sand-blown villages, in blood-stained hospitals. He had seen eyes just as white, bodies just as taut. And he knew what they needed wasn't force, wasn't orders. It was presence. So he gave that hour after hour. Tommy Rivera noticed first. The boy had taken to hovering around the stalls during his breaks, carrying water buckets or sweeping the aisle just to be near. He had watched Daniel every day, marking little notches on the wood of the stall door with a piece of chalk day 1 after the setback. Day 2, day 3. By day 4, he stopped bothering with numbers. He simply carved a small line that meant, "He's still here." "You've got more patience than a priest at confession," Sheriff Hank Douglas said one afternoon, leaning his heavy frame against the rail. His voice was half amused, half admiring. Daniel glanced over the faintest of smiles, tugging at his lips. "I don't know about that. Priests don't have to deal with 1,000 pounds of panic trying to kick the walls down." The sheriff chuckled. "Maybe not. But you sit there like a man waiting on an answer from God, and you might just get one." Hank didn't linger. Lawmen never did. But his presence was like a hand on the shoulder, a reminder that someone outside the ranch still believed in him, or at least wanted him to succeed. Tommy, on the other hand, stuck close. He carried feed, refilled water, kept tools polished. He listened more than he spoke, and in that silence, Daniel saw the glimmer of faith, a kind the boy didn't even realize he was giving. It mattered. More than either of them said aloud. Victoria Mallory surprised him the most. At first, she kept her distance. She arrived with the same heels and pressed suits, carrying trays of food she claimed were for the staff, but always set within reach of Daniel. She would drop them on the bench and walk away, her posture stiff with pride. But as the days passed, the routine shifted. One evening, she lingered a few minutes longer, pretending to check her phone, while Daniel murmured to Midnight. Another day, she returned with simpler clothes, boots, jeans, a plain sweater, and instead of leaving, she sat down beside him on the bale of hay. They didn't talk. Not at first. Hours stretched, broken only by the steady hum of Daniel's voice and the rustle of midnight's restless movements. Victoria simply sat near her silence, no longer a shield, but a bridge. Daniel noticed the way she stole glances at him, not with scorn now, but with curiosity. She noticed the way his shoulders carried a weight that never seemed to ease, and how his calm wasn't emptiness, it was strength carved from pain. What had begun as surveillance became companionship. One night she brought 2 mugs of coffee instead of 1 tray of food. She didn't say anything as she handed him one, their fingers brushing for an instant. His eyes lifted, meeting hers. For the briefest heartbeat, the air shifted. Then she looked away, sipping her drink as though nothing had happened. The silence between them changed after that. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't hostile. It was shared. By the 5th day, midnight began to stir differently. He no longer hid in the corner every time Daniel entered. He lifted his head when the soldier's voice carried into the stall ears, flicking toward the sound. On the 6th day, he came closer to the door, nostrils flaring as if searching for something. He leaned toward the fabric of Daniel's shirt, breathing in the scent of sweat hay and something steady. Then just as quickly, he pulled back, eyes wary. Daniel didn't press. He simply extended a hand into the air and let it hang palm open, offering nothing but choice. Midnight didn't take it, not yet. But the stallion didn't rear or scream either. That was progress. On the 7th day, Daniel brought a brush. He didn't hide it, didn't force it. He simply rested it on his knee and let the horse see. When midnight finally edged close enough, trembling Daniel reached slowly, gently, and laid the brush against his side. The stallion flinched violently, but he didn't strike. Daniel whispered steady words, moving the brush in small circles. Midnight trembled under the touch, but minute by minute his trembling eased. "Good boy," Daniel murmured. Just like that. It was the first grooming the stallion had accepted in years. The next evening, Daniel laid a saddle blanket across Midnight's back. The horse tensed legs, quivering, memories of pain flashing through him. But Daniel's hand was there, calm on his neck, his voice low and grounding. After long moments of taut stillness, the stallion exhaled, and he let the blanket stay. On the 9th day, Daniel walked beside him in the pen. Midnight didn't rear. He didn't bolt. He simply walked, heavy hooves sinking into the sand, his flank brushing close enough to graze Daniel's shoulder. For the first time, man and horse moved together. It wasn't just the horse that changed. Late one evening, Daniel leaned wearily against the stall after hours of coaxing and brushing. His body was tired, shoulders slumped, voice rough, from talking to an animal that rarely replied. Victoria appeared in the aisle carrying 2 bottles of water. She handed him one wordlessly. Their hands touched. Just a brush of skin against skin. Daniel's eyes lifted. Victoria's lingered just for a moment too long. Something flickered there, acknowledgement, vulnerability, maybe even gratitude. He muttered, "Thanks," his voice softer than usual. She gave the faintest nod, lips curving not into a smirk, but into something gentler. She turned away quickly, but the air between them hummed with unspoken things. Through those 9 days, it wasn't only Midnight who relearned trust. Victoria did too. She had once thought of Daniel Hayes as a joke, a drifter, a pawn in her wager. Now she saw him as something else, entirely a man who carried storms inside him and yet offered calm to everything he touched. And against her will, against her pride, she felt drawn to him. By the end of those 9 days, Mallory Ranch was no longer just a stage for humiliation. It had become something far more dangerous, far more precious. It had become a place where trust was being rebuilt, not just between man and horse, but between man and woman. Two people from worlds apart, finding in silence what words had never given them. The valley had dressed itself for celebration. Pennants snapped along the fences of Mallory Ranch, flashes of color against a big blue Texas sky. Speakers cracked and thumped out fiddle tunes and country hooks the sound, carrying all the way to the parking fields where pickup trucks gleamed in the sun. The smell of kettle corn and roasted corn on the cob drifted over the grandstands, and the aisles were packed as shoulder to shoulder. Locals in sweat-darkened hats, kids with paper flags, investors in linen suits, journalists with camera straps cutting diagonals across their jackets. On the infield, volunteers chalked fresh lines and raked new circles into the sand, and their shadows small and quick beneath the towering lights. The rodeo ran hot and happy. Bulls bucked like earthquakes and tossed men into the sky to land grinning and dusty. A trick roping team carved silver circles in the air loops, kissing loops in perfect timing. Barrel racers blurred into crimson streaks, horses turning so tight the crowd leaned with them. Between events, the MC's voice ribbed and boomed, half showman, half master of ceremonies, revving the crowd back up whenever they settled. But the electricity running under all of it had a darker edge. It grew every time a timer buzzed or a gate clanged shut, every time the announcer said, "Coming up later tonight." The rumor had outgrown the posters. The stadium was not just full, it was braced. People had come to see a miracle or a death. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC teased during a lull voice sliding toward theatrical doom tonight, "you'll witness the impossible. Or a tragedy." Nervous laughter rose like sparks and winked out. Backstage, the noise thinned to a muffled ocean. In a corner stall draped with canvas to block the worst of the stares, Daniel Hayes checked the saddle blanket again, even though he knew he wouldn't need it. He smoothed its edge with the flat of his palm, and then set it aside. Midnight stood half-lit in the shadowed space tail, flicking muscles tight under his black coat. He wasn't screaming. He hadn't screamed for days. He trembled instead, as if the whole arena were a storm smelling of rain and old pain. Victoria hovered near the stall door, dressed in what passed for armor. Now clean boots, a dark blazer, her hair pulled back. The usual chill in her eyes had softened. Worry introduced a small human disorder to her perfect posture. Elodie stood between them, hugging a worn paperback to her chest, the way other children hold teddy bears, the blue ribbon she'd braided into Midnight's mane, peeking out like a secret. "You don't have to do it," Victoria said, too quietly to be picked up by any mic, too carefully to be overheard by any investor who might be lurking. "I'll call it off. I'll take the blame." Daniel ran his hand down Midnight's neck. The horse shivered under his touch, then leaned just a breath, just enough to tell Daniel the thread still held. He looked at Victoria, and a tired smile lifted one corner of his mouth. "It's not for them," he said. "It never was." The gate marshal waved. "You're up." Daniel took the lead rope. Elodie reached for his sleeve. "Dad." Her voice carried, barely piped and soft. He touched his forehead to hers. "Easy," he said. "He knows you're here." They walked to the tunnel. The sound of the crowd grew teeth and breath. The iron bars vibrated under Daniel's palm. He inhaled and felt the familiar weight settle into his chest, the heavy, hard calm that had lived there since another life. Sand, sun, a horizon that never moved. He let it fill him, then he let it go. The gate rolled back. Light hit them like a wave. The ring was a bowl of sound and color everywhere, eyes everywhere, noise. Midnight froze nostrils, flaring tension rippling through him like a pulled wire. He tried to backpedal, hooves scooping sand. His ears flattened at the roar. Daniel stepped with him, not to stop the movement, but to be in it, Shoulder at the shoulder of the rope, a lazy curve between them. "Easy, boy," he said the words, a tone more than a sentence. "I'm here." They took 3 steps into open space. The crowd reacted like crowds do. Comments hissed through the front rows and floated up through the tiers. "That horse is gonna kill him. Watch this turn to blood. He's insane." On an aisle above the chute gate, a small clot of investors stood with their arms folded, faces arranged in the careful, bored expressions of men who want very much to see something go wrong and then very much to be above it. Midnight tried the old language of survival, spin, surge, recoil, but the circle held. Daniel let the energy loop past him, let it rush out and fall into the sand. He didn't take it. He didn't give it back. Slowly, the stallion's breaths came less like knives and more like waves. Near the center of the arena, Daniel stopped. He slid his fingers along the cheek piece of the bridle, touched the bit, and in one smooth motion, undid the buckles. Metal kissed metal, then kissed sand. The bit and bridle fell with a clatter that cut through the arena noise like a dropped plate in a quiet kitchen. Thousands of people inhaled together. On the platform, the MC's patter strangled mid-sentence. He's riding him bareback, the mic finally managed voice, cracking through the speakers. No control at all. In the shadows of the cheap seats, Colton Briggs laughed, and the sound carried farther than it should have, slick with resentment. That fool just signed his death warrant. Daniel didn't look for the voice. He laid a hand in Midnight's mane, feeling skin and heat, and the tiny tremor in the muscle, then slid onto the stallion's back in a single, easy movement, like getting up from the ground to stand. He could feel the change instantly. The horse gathering the horse, agreeing to hold still because the weight was different, because the weight said, "I trust you first." For a heartbeat, they were a statue. In the owner's box, a wine glass tightened in an invisible grip. In the tunnel, a girl held her book and forgot to breathe. Out in the ring, a veteran closed his eyes and listened for the sound only he could hear. Daniel turned his head to the grandstands. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried anyway, as simple, flat, and certain as a bell. "His name is Midnight," he said, "and he is not a monster." Silence fell in the way it rarely does before a crowd total absolute. The sentence seemed to sit in the open air, becoming part of the place, the boards, the rails, the sand, the horse. Daniel didn't kick. He didn't cluck. He breathed and shifted his weight the way men shift in their sleep when they turn from a dream. Midnight stepped. One foot, then the next, finding the ground, as if the ground had always been meant for him. They traced a circle inside the circle, slow and balanced. The first steps were skittish and the energy still too sharp, but Daniel sat deep and low and let the motion bleed through him to the sand. He felt the ripple under him, change the flinch, trembling into cadence, the quick into steady. He touched his heel to rib, not as a command, but as a quiet yes. Midnight's ears released a degree. His neck softened a degree. And the walk became a jog, the jog a canter that wasn't a flight, but a rhythm. Somewhere in the middle rows, a camera shutter remembered to click. A journalist let her pen hover over a line she'd almost written and drew a brand new one instead. They curved across the ring. Daniel leaned a breath to the inside and thought the idea turn, and the horse turned the kind of turn that looks like it's being done by both of you at once. Sand spooled up in light rings under their path. The canter carried into an easy gallop, not a tear, not a bolt, just the grace of speed unveiled the motion of a body remembering how it was made to move. There was no rope, no bit, no visible cue. There was weight and balance. There was breath and trust. The language belonged to the old world, older than reins, older than spurs, older even than fear. They crossed the center line, and Daniel let the gallop stretch. Midnight lengthened like a shadow. At dusk, bared his teeth to the wind, and didn't bite, simply took it into his lungs until his whole frame said, "This, this, this." They swung wide by the chutes, every cowboy inside them quiet. They passed the photographer's pit, and every lens chased them. They arrowed toward the owner's box, and Victoria stood without realizing she'd stood hand over her heart, the tears she'd promised herself not to shed cooling the air on her cheek. If there were words in Daniel's mouth, no one heard them. If there were prayers, they were not to be spoken in a stadium. He asked for nothing more than the next stride. He promised nothing more than the next breath. On the far rail, a kid climbed up on the bottom rung for a better view and forgot to let go. His father's hand found his shirt before he fell, and the boy laughed without looking away from the dark horse flying on nothing. They came down to the canter again, not because Daniel pulled them there, but because both of them wanted to stay a little longer in the place between speed and stillness, where the world narrows and the body speaks. Daniel sat deeper steel in the spine water in the hips and let the rhythm wash his bones clean. He shifted back and down and thought, stop. Midnight stopped. Not a jolt, not a brace. A closing of a story in the place where the last line belongs. Sand settled around their hooves. For 3 counts, the entire arena held its breath. Then the sound hit like thunder rolling off hills. People rose as one. Hands became a storm. Whistles knifed the air. The bleachers shivered under boots. The name that rose surprised even Daniel Hayes. Hayes, because the crowd had decided that night that he was not a ghost, but a man. And men have names, and you say them when you're grateful. Daniel bowed his head until his forehead touched the coarse hair of Midnight's crest. The stallion turned his head a fraction and breathed into Daniel's shirt. "You did it, boy." Daniel whispered the words, getting lost in the roar and not caring. "You're free." Midnight's exhale found the hollow of Daniel's neck. Warmth, weight, a lightness after it, the kind that follows a weight you've shouldered for too long when you finally put it down. They left the ring slow because there was no reason to hurry. The gate swallowed them into shadow. The noise fell behind like a tide going out. Cameras and microphones sprang from the dark like weeds, reporters calling questions, flashes, strobing investors, sudden best friends with hands outstretched. Daniel didn't break stride. He didn't look at any of them. He walked next to Midnight, his forearm laid along the horse's neck like a promise. In the corridor away from the eyes, footsteps came quick. Victoria reached them, and in an instant, the rest of the world drifted 6 inches to the left and went out of focus. She didn't look like the CEO of anything. She looked like a woman who had run somewhere and hadn't remembered to breathe yet. Her eyes were rimmed red, and the perfection of her hair had surrendered to one strand that had slipped free and refused to go back. "The deal was a joke," she said, voice rough, barely above the sound of Midnight's breath. "But what I feel now isn't." The hubbub behind them dimmed. People pretended not to listen and failed. A cameraman lowered his rig and stared at the floor. Daniel's smile was rare and real. He kept his hand on the stallion and lifted his eyes to hers. "I never rode for the deal," he said. "I rode for him. And maybe for you." She let out the breath she'd been holding for a month. The wet in her eyes didn't shame her now. She didn't lean in, he didn't either. Their gaze held long enough that the air around them changed its mind about what it was. Midnight flicked an ear. Elodie skidded around the corner with her ribbon askew and her book under her arm, and the spell, like all good spells, didn't break. It settled into something you could carry. The rodeo buzzed and danced until the moon cut clean across the sky. Headlines went to press photos, found screens. Money moved in ways money always does when it smells a story. None of it mattered for a few hours. Daniel cooled the horse out in quiet circles. Elodie dozed on a hay bale, the paperback falling open to the middle. Victoria sat near enough that their shoulders almost touched, and far enough that the moment didn't ask for more than it should. The next week, the ranch returned to its rhythms. But the rhythms had changed. A month later, Mallory Ranch held a different kind of gathering. There were still tables and microphones, but the backdrop wasn't an arena. It was a fence line that ran along a field left high on purpose grasses, moving in one living sheet under the wind. A new wooden sign hung from chains between two posts. The letters had been burned deep and clean into the plank. The Wilder Way, healing, not breaking. Reporters loved the phrase. Investors loved the shift. The world was hungry for stories that sounded like compassion and still paid. The old guard sneered in private and smiled in public. Children asked if they could pet the horses and were told, not today, but soon. Stable hands who had once practiced their best statue impression leaned on the rails quietly and did not say out loud the things they were thinking. Victoria did the talking. She stood with the sign at her back and spoke in a voice that moved easily now between boardroom and barn aisle. We built this place to prove we could control what we feared, she said. We were wrong. The only honest work here begins where control ends. We won't break animals here. We'll listen to them. We'll learn what happened to them. We'll give them time. We'll give them presence. If they choose to meet us, we will meet them. She didn't say Daniel's name at first. She didn't have to. He stood a little to one side, hands in his pockets, as if he'd wandered into a picture he didn't know he was in. When she did say it, it was only to anchor the story to the man who had taught her how to tell it. Reporters took down the quote. Cameras framed the shot. Colton Briggs did not attend. There were rumors of him taking work in places where no one knew his face. Leland Blackwood's lawyer had issued a press release using all the words a man like that uses when he has been told to leave quietly. Money shrugged its shoulders and found other places to sit. Tommy Rivera started wearing a different badge on his shirt. Assistant trainer. He tried to pretend it didn't make him walk taller. He failed. Sheriff Hank showed up sometimes without calling ahead. Leaned on a gate, watched in thoughtful silence, and tipped his hat like you do when something is going right. Midnight didn't care about any of it. He was not a story to himself. He was a horse alive, finally allowed to be what that means. In the mornings, he stood on the rise where the fence bent, and the wind found the long hairs under his chin, breathing so big, the grass wavered. In the afternoons, he dropped his head and lipped at Elodie's pockets until she giggled and produced the thin carrots she always pretended she hadn't brought. When Daniel took him down along the creek, the stallion's ears swiveled to listen to water. When they stopped to do nothing, he did nothing like a champion. Visitors came and pressed their hands to the rails to see him. They whispered because it felt like a church. Someone always said, "Is that really him?" as if monsters once named can't become something else. Daniel let them watch for a while, then led Midnight back to where no one asked him to be anything but himself. For some men, proof must be loud and sharp. Daniel watched the quiet proof move through the ranch and felt something inside him unclench. The place where the worst nights had been stored consulted this new day and decided to loosen its grip. Not vanish, not forget. Just shift the weight to a part of the body that could carry it. As for Victoria and Daniel, they didn't say much about what they were. They didn't have to. You could see it in the way her stride slowed to match his when he was tired, and in the way his mouth softened into something like peace when she came around the corner of the barn. You could see it in the way their arguments were shorter now and more honest. You could see it when she laughed at something small and then looked surprised to find herself doing it. Late light made long gold out of everything. One evening, they walked the fence line in that hour that makes the world look truer than it should. A woman who had believed most in control and a man who had been carried too far by war, both of them sanded smoother by the same horse. Elodie rode ahead on a patient pony with burrs in its mane and a name she had changed 3 times. She kept turning in the saddle to make sure the adults were still behind her, and then turned back again to describe a new plan for the wildflower bed she wanted to plant by the shed. Her voice rose and fell, got distracted by a red-tailed hawk returned to the exact place in the story where she'd left it. Victoria reached for the top rail of the fence as they paused and leaned there in an echo of 100 quieter moments. Daniel rested his forearms beside hers. For a while, they simply watched Midnight, who had found his patch of sun and was doing the good work of grazing. "You know," Victoria said, after the kind of silence that feels like a breath you're willing to hold forever, "I don't remember the last time the ranch felt like this." "Like what?" Daniel asked. "Like a place worth living in," she said, not looking at him. And then, because the woman she had been would have swallowed it, and the woman she was becoming didn't. She turned her head and met his eyes. "Thank you." He shook his head. "You chose it." "I chose you," she said, and then smiled as if surprised by the shape of the truth in her mouth. "And he chose you first." She nodded toward the field. Midnight lifted his head, ears pricked to some sound. Only he heard Longtail switching lazily. The blue ribbon Elodie had woven into his mane rippled like a signature. Wind moved through the grass. Somewhere down by the barn, Tommy shouted something happy to no one in particular. Sheriff Hank's cruiser rolled by on the road and didn't stop. In the tall sky, a hawk rode an invisible river and then folded its wings to drop. They stood together and let the day go where days go. The deal that had been a joke had burned away in the heat of what they had made in its place. No contracts, no bets, no bridle. Just a horse that was not a monster. A man who had learned to be still until the world came back to him. A woman who had let go of power and found something heavier and better to carry. Twilight washed the field in a color like forgiveness. Elodie's laughter ran ahead of them toward home, bright and unafraid. Behind the fence, Midnight lifted into an easy, unhurried canter, and for a sweet, brief stretch of earth, he looked exactly like the thing they had all been trying to remember since the day free.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.